Ok, allora innanzitutto vorrei ringraziare gli organizzatori e organizzatora per questo magnifico convegno durante il quale giapponesi, italiani e persino americani parlano in francese, ma i francesi sono invitati a fare le sue relazioni in inglese. È una bellissima tradizione di traduzione dell'ospitalità in azione, dove la questione della lingua degli altri gioca un ruolo determinante. Grazie quindi per questa esperienza e per tutto quello che le vostre relazioni mi hanno dato finora. Non sarò mai più lo stesso. Grazie. So, in the remnant of this talk, I want to investigate the work of Levinas, the works of Levinas with the following paradox in mind. The ethical subject bears the burden of the others, even to the point of suffering and death. And yet, this suffering is meaningful only insofar as the subject remains and persists in existence. A paradox that suggests the necessity of a prior conatus or vital impetus, vital force. It might well be that the Levinasian God does not have to be, il n'a pas à être. But before any human beings can respond to the other, they must be, they have to be. And this necessity of being entails a constant and always recurring struggle against annihilation. What my how does it work? Okay. There's one slide that is missing. I don't know why. Sorry.
Vous laquelle?
C'est le nom François. Elle a disparu. Wow. Pourquoi elle aurait disparu?
Ceci est la première.
Ah,
La deuxième,
ok.
c'est ce qu'on voit là-bas. Et c'est la prochaine.
Ok, il y en a une qui a disparu.
Ah, je sais pas.
Ça, tu sais pas. Bon, ça va. Les magies de la technique. Ça va. Okay, this is quite embarrassing because I wanted to have a picture of my dear colleague from Nanterre, François David Seba, and the cover of one of his books, which is called Éthique du survivant. And it was a sort of a homage to him. So it's very embarrassing that it was somehow deleted. My apologies for that. Okay, let's focus. According to this initial paradox, the ethical demand does not erase the conatus, but rather presupposes it. Levinas explicitly resists a philosophy that is grounded in the egoistic effort to maintain oneself. His critique of Heideggerian ontology revolves around the argument that the question of being and even the existential structure of Dasein presupposes a more primordial relation to the other, one that ruptures totality and introduces an ethical demand. However, Levinas portrays a living being that is fundamentally concerned with its own survival. The ego lives from the world. Each ego eats, enjoys, takes shelter. All expressions of a proto-ethical vitality that mirrors the Spinozist conatus and by extension the Darwinian drive for self-preservation, not to mention the drive for multiplication and all the actions that were often said to be performed in the interest of the species, referring to actions or decisions that are beneficial to the survival, reproduction, and overall well-being of a particular species, regardless of the individuals. Despite Levinas' emphasis on the radical transcendence of ethics, his work is never entirely free from what I would call the gravitational pull of being. While he sought to establishing ethics as first philosophy, his descriptions of embodiment, laziness, effort, hunger, enjoyment, but also, in a sense, dwelling, suggest that the Conatus Essendi, the striving for persistence in being, continues to resonate within and throughout his philosophical anthropology. In this sense, Levinas' ethics is haunted by the vital impulse and ontological presuppositions it attempts to transcend. In fact, it could be tempting to provide you, the beautiful and much diverse people of Levinasians, with a complete list of occurrences, providing a complete inventory of the phrase Conatus Essendi in Levinas' works. However magnificent and interesting such a program would be, I confess that it could easily lead you to a state bordering boredom, so I will spare you. But if you feel any of the symptoms, just raise your hand. I will instead explore a selection of texts from different periods in order to highlight certain lines of continuity. At some point in De l'existence à l'existant, in the second preface, Levinas feels the need to demarcate his project from the focus on the Conatus Essendi. Here you have a quote. Mais la déneutralisation ne saurait prendre son sens véritablement humain dans le Conatus Essendi des vivants, des existants, ni dans le monde où ils se tiennent et où la sauvagerie de leur souci de soi se civilise, mais tourne à l'indifférence, à l'équilibre anonyme de force et ainsi, s'il le faut, à la guerre. Thus, here, what strikes me is Levinas notes two things. If we must proceed from existence to the existence, the existent in question is a living being, un vivant, des vivants, des existants. Hein? We might therefore be tempted to accredit a certain vitalism here, that of the Conatus Essendi, of perseverance in existence. But Levinas rejects this solution because he considers that the world of Conatus Essendi is that of the search for salvation without regard for others, sans égard pour les autres. The world of the Conatus Essendi is a world of wars. We must therefore find a way out of the theories in the proximity of others, dans la proximité d'autrui. However, Levinas persists in using terms that border on the agonistic. Consider, for instance, this quote here. La dualité de l'existence et de l'existant est certes paradoxale, puisque ce qui existe ne peut rien conquérir s'il n'existe pas déjà. How can one explain the choice of the verb to conquer, conquérir, to describe the basic or primary properties of the existent or living being? Levinas describes here the process of assumption, of assuming, itself described as conquête de l'être qui recommence perpétuellement. Levinas refers to a conquest which both requires the existence of the existent and a cleavage between existence and existent. For example, illumination, the act of opening the eyes and welcoming the light. But one cannot escape the fact that this reference to conquering powerfully echoes the vocabulary of Darwinian competition. So Levinas intends to problematize this logic of power and domination. Its recurrence in his work signals a recognition of the structural necessity of struggle in life, a concession that human existence is not immune to the pressures of survival and persistence. Interestingly enough, Darwin borrows from Malthus not one, but two rival expressions, struggle for existence and struggle for life. And Levinas develops his own interpretation of them without regard for the two different expressions, appearing to make no difference at all between the two, taking the struggle, generally speaking, as an interesting form of articulation between existence and existence. But the Conatus Essendi that expresses or translates the struggle for life is not flatly materialistic, because Levinas claims, yes, these were the quotes about lutte pour la vie et lutte pour l'existence. A little bit later, you have this idea that the Conatus seems to seek local objects, but through them, it aims at abstract existence. The struggle for existence is described as a struggle for the future, not far in some way from Heideggerian Sorge. So the limitations of the concept of struggle for life or struggle for existence, according to Levinas, are, from what I understand, twofold. On the one hand, struggle for existence already presupposes what is at issue for Levinas, namely how being comes into existence, how self becomes ego. On the other hand, struggle for life constitutes only a basic foundation, while reflections on the meaning of life, le sens de la vie, or the love of life, l'amour de la vie, are necessarily in excess above this basic line of struggle for life. But here in this quote, what strikes me is the word racine, the roots. L'attitude sur le sens de la vie, l'amour de la vie, quelque profonde que soient les racines qui la rattachent à l'opération par laquelle l'être naît à l'existence, se place déjà au-delà de cette naissance. It is important to note here how important is the use of the term roots. The roots are buried, most often invisible, but they cannot be neglected, they cannot be cut. So this tension in Levinas' thinking between acknowledging the importance to preserve, protect, and nourish the roots of the living, and at the same time the necessity to go beyond mere preservation of life, is not a failure of consistency, but an index of the complexity of Levinas' ethical vision. He does not deny the ego's impulse towards self-maintenance, rather he suspends it in the name of a responsibility that disrupts and contests its primacy. Yet again, this suspension is only possible because the ego already exists, endures, and strives. The Conatus Essendi then, while repressed, always returns and recurs as the silent condition of possibility for ethical transcendence. And here, I think it would be useful to make some room to the concept of need, besoin, as one of the processes underlying and concretely translating the conatus or vital impulse into practical actions. The question of the conatus, of the effort of the existent to persevere in existence, implies not only the question of effort, but also that of need. Now, Levinas strongly criticizes Plato concerning the status of need. Need is a source of plenitude and richness, as is said in Totalité et Infini. But this theme was already developed in section 3 of De l'Évasion. Le besoin nous tourne ainsi vers autre chose que nous. Levinas' entire analysis proceeds from this reversal of the concept of need. Far from indicating a lack, an insufficiency, need reveals an openness to something other than ourselves. Or, la souffrance du besoin n'indique nullement un manque à combler, elle ne nous dénonce pas comme des êtres finis, l'être n'ayant pas satisfait ses besoins meurt. This is the type of idea that I feel is developed over and over in Levinas' works, with a constant analysis of effort and related concepts as fatigue, laziness, etc. Let us now open, for instance, Le Temps et l'Autre, where matter, or the physical body, is depicted as the misfortune of the hypostasis. And yet, Levinas insists we may call the whole of the preoccupations that fill our long days and that tear us from our solitude to throw us into relations with our fellow men. We may call this a fall, daily life, animality, degradation, and sordid materialism. However, these preoccupations have, in any case, nothing frivolous. Levinas, in this section, draws an antinomy between the need to save oneself and the need to satisfy oneself, Jacob and Esau. Certainly, through this reminder of the episode when Esau, Isaac's firstborn son, renounced his birthright to his younger brother Jacob in exchange for a bowl of stew or a plate of lentils, Levinas does not go as far as claiming that to satisfy oneself is also a way of saving oneself, an admittedly prosaic way of maintaining oneself in existence, but in nonetheless has the will to go beyond Jean-Paul Sartre, for whom the whole weight of existence is rejected into the past. Il n'est peut-être pas juste de dire que nous vivons pour manger, mais il n'est pas plus juste de dire que nous mangeons pour vivre. La dernière finalité du manger est contenue dans l'aliment. So just as the smell is the purpose of feeling, of smelling, the act of eating should not be reduced to simply maintaining the metabolism. In other words, metabolism does not exhaust pleasure. The analysis of the act of eating cannot ignore food. Thus, paradoxically, the act of feeding oneself is ecstatic. Enjoyment is an exit from oneself that does not aim at oneself. By highlighting food, Levinas refutes Darwin in the sense that the act of feeding oneself is not a simple effect of the Conatus Essendi. We do not eat to live. We eat to discover the qualities of food. Beyond the materialistic lessons of Darwinism, Levinas claims the morality of earthly foods is the first morality, the first abnegation, not the last, but one must go through it. So these themes are these themes are taken up very precisely in Totalité Infinie, especially in section 2A2. Nous vivons de bonne soupe, d'air, de lumière, de spectacle, de travail, d'idées, de sommeil, etc. Ce ne sont pas là objets de représentation, nous en vivons. Ce dont nous vivons n'est pas non plus moyen de vie, etc. Where it is recalled, contra Heidegger again, that the things we live by are not only instruments, ustensiles, but also objects of enjoyment offering themselves as matters of taste, comme des affaires de goût. Levinas makes an effort to consider the full metaphysical power of living from, vivre de, and in particular, he emphasizes how this living from transcends the categories of act and potentiality central to Aristotelian ontology. More importantly, living from is considered by Levinas as the quintessence of enjoyment and as the paradigm of all active verbs, just like existe has received an active form. It was explained yesterday. A few words in conclusion. Levinas does not by any means glorify the conatus. In fact, he often treats it with irony, as seen in passages like this one, where he refers to the one in Plotinus not as something that perseveres in being. Comment comprendre le conatus de l'être dans la bonté du bien? Car comment chez Plotin l'un déborderait-il de plénitude et serait-il source d'émanation si l'un persévérait dans l'être, s'il ne signifiait pas d'en deçà ou d'au-delà de l'être à partir de la proximité, c'est-à-dire à partir du désintéressement, à partir de la signification, à partir de l'un pour l'autre. Irony appears again in another passage, for instance, where the living being, dominated by the conatus, is likened to a dog that has a strong likeness to the famous Bobby. So I just take a quote, but this passage was cited already yesterday, I think, by Dan Arbib and also by my previous colleague that left. So it's important because just giving a few lines loses the context. But let us read those lines. Il y a là, certes, une ambiguïté insurmontable. Le moi incarné, le moi de chair et de sang, peut perdre sa signification, s'affirmer animalement dans son conatus et sa joie. C'est un chien qui reconnaît comme sien Ulysse, venant prendre possession de son bien. Mais cette ambiguïté est la condition de la vulnérabilité même, c'est-à-dire de la sensibilité comme signification. You see that I have emphasized c'est un chien because it might sound like a sort of insult, I think, but I don't think it is the case. It's much more subtle than that. But to be a dog is not something that a human wants to be. So there's something very ambiguous to me in this sentence. This could be taken as a sort of funny joke or as a reference to mythology or the Iliad. The Odyssey, maybe. The Odyssey, sorry. But I could take this as a funny joke if this was not also a description of pregnancy in women, as we have just seen. C'est un chien qui reconnaît comme sien Ulysse venant prendre possession de son bien. So I think dogginess is like conatus and maybe happiness and joy. It might be sex-dependent variable. So I read these moments as ironic, but not contemptuous. Despite Levinas' evident amusement with materialistic concerns, he never dismisses them. He consistently grappled with the Conatus Essendi, and many of his reflections on need, enjoyment, and eating testify to a deep love of life. For Levinas, existence is intrinsically that of a living being experiencing the Conatus Essendi. This should not dictate her ethics, but neither should it be ignored or ridiculed. That, I believe, is the powerful lesson of wisdom that Levinas has passed on to us. Thank you for your attention.